The beginning of the end for John F. Kennedy Jr. started out like a normal day. He had just bought an airplane, taken flying lessons, and was going to fly his plane to his cousin's wedding. As a son of a one-time president of the United States, flying a plane was just one of the impressive things he was capable of doing. However, a day that started out with happy smiles and high hopes soon turned into something bleak and tragic, scattering his body and those on board his plane across the Atlantic Ocean, never to be heard from again forever. But the pain of the final minutes of his life would only mean more when we take a trip back in time to the exciting and impressive life that John F. Kennedy Jr. lived right from when his father was assassinated. Let's start from the beginning, shall we?
So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby.
John F. Kennedy Jr. had a childhood that many other children only dream of. Born on November 25, 1960, John's arrival on Earth seemed to be a sign, or a good omen of some kind, as his father had just been elected President of the United States less than 3 weeks before. As a result, Kennedy Jr. lived the early parts of his life in the White House. Alongside his older sister Caroline, the Kennedy family were the picture-perfect idea of how an American family ought to look like. Under the leadership of his charismatic father, Kennedy Jr. basically lived in the spotlight even as a child. However, he seemed to be comfortable on camera and had no problem being the object of attention as the president's son. However, on November 22, 1963, something horrible happened. No one had ever seen it coming, and it was a huge blow to the Kennedy family and the entire United States at large. John F. Kennedy has been riding in his motorcade, going about this presidential business through downtown Dallas, Texas, when he was tragically assassinated and succumbed to his bullet wounds, dropping dead on the spot. The entire nation was thrown into mourning, and Kennedy Jr. was only 3 years old at the time. As sad as this was for the family, it didn't stop young Kennedy from taking the spotlight during his father's funeral, as he shot a final salute at his deceased father when his casket passed by. The photo taken from that encounter was said to be the most impressive shot in the history of television, and the media had quite a frenzy with it. However, Kennedy Jr.'s mother, Jackie, was more worried than she'd ever been. Her husband had just been assassinated, and she suddenly didn't feel safe anymore. All she could think of was, who's next? So, in 1968, following her maternal instincts and what she thought was the right move at the time, she packed her bags, grabbed her children, and fled the United States. When she was asked why she took such a drastic move, she said, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." Little did Jackie realize that one move would lead her into the arms of another man. Later that same year, Jackie fell in love and married a Greek tycoon named Aristotle Onassis, and the new family moved into his private island where it was safe for Jackie and her children. However, Kennedy Jr. was not at all thrilled about his stepfather, and when asked about what he thought about Aristotle, Kennedy responded by saying he thought of his stepfather as a joke. As Kennedy grew older, perhaps as a result of his genes of the fact that he admired his late fathers a lot, he began to develop an interest in helping people, politics, and looking out for the little guy. So shortly after the demise of his stepfather, Aristotle, Kennedy and his family visited the White House again for the first time since the assassination and were given a tour by the then-sitting president, Nixon. This simply fueled his desire and passion for politics, and for the next few decades of his life, he acted upon his desires. Just like his father, Kennedy Jr. began to exhibit leadership qualities. One of the shining examples in this regard was right after he graduated from high school. He and his mom went on a trip to Africa. However, the group he was in got terribly lost for 2 whole days, and there was fear and panic all over. Regardless, Kennedy took control and eventually, as a result of his sound leadership, was able to rescue them and help his group get home. On top of all that, in 1976, Kennedy Jr. and his cousin visited an earthquake disaster zone in Guatemala. There, they helped rebuild with the local residents as well as helped to distribute food and much-needed supplies. However, rather than retire to his well-furnished tent or a hotel a few towns away, Kennedy was said to have blended perfectly with the victims of the earthquake. He ate what they ate, dressed exactly how they dressed, and even slept in the poorly constructed tents like the victims themselves, and this sent a strong message to the people. According to the local priest, he did more for our country's image here in Guatemala than a room full of ambassadors. The older he became, the more interested and passionate he was about the political terrain. So when he gained admission into Brown University, it was no surprise to anyone that he chose to study American Studies, and even went ahead to co-found a student group discussion that focused on contemporary issues like the apartheid in South Africa, as well as gun control and civil rights. Soon after, he gave his first speech. But aside from all the great things John Kennedy had done and was interested in, one of them suddenly took the majority of his interests, and it was the ambition to become a pilot. As a matter of fact, this didn't come as a shock to his family because John had been expressing his interest in flying planes and becoming a pilot ever since he was a little boy, and now that he could, he began to take flying lessons around the late 1990s, even though his mother and sister were against it. So at the Flight Safety Academy in Vero Beach, Florida, every other day, John would take his flying lessons and pay close attention to all his instructors taught him. In 1998, he was finally awarded his pilot's license, and to him, there was only one more thing left to do: buy a plane. The following year, John bought his first aircraft from a company called Airbound Aviation, the Piper Saratoga Light aircraft. It was a beautiful single-engine plane with 6 seaters and amazing leather cushions. In today's era, the aircraft would cost anywhere between $300,000 and $400,000. However, as proud as John was of his new plane, little did he know this was the beginning of doom for him, and soon, what people referred to as the Kennedy curse was about to strike yet again. Within the next 3 months, on July 16, 1999, John and his wife prepared for a trip to his cousin's wedding all the way in Hyannisport. As one might imagine, John was more than excited to take his plane on a spin once more. He was new to flying his own plane, and he relished every opportunity he could to do that. But there was something wrong about this particular flight he was about to embark on, something life-threatening if only he took heed. On that day, John and his wife Carolyn headed to the Essex County Airport near Fairfield, New Jersey. They were joined by his sister-in-law, Lauren Bissett. Lauren wasn't supposed to accompany them to the wedding. She was going to be dropped off at Martha's Vineyard and then carry on to Hyannisport. The plan was simple: 1 flight, 2 destinations. But this journey ended up making the history books for being one of the worst disasters remembered by the world till date. Regardless, there were signs of impending doom. Earlier in the week before the journey, John had confided with one of his close friends and confessed that he was a bit nervous to fly his plane to his cousin's wedding, reason being the weather that week had been poor, and this could be disastrous for a flight. More so, the evening before the flight, John had looked up at the night sky and tried to observe the weather conditions, and he knew it was not favorable. Although he had a pilot's license, it only permitted him to fly when there was high visibility. He was nowhere near experienced to fly in poor weather conditions. But on the other hand, his wife and sister-in-law were keen on making this trip in time, as it was in their schedules and only a private flight could get them there fast. He could not let them down, so he figured he'd make the flight and they'd be safe, so he dismissed his doubts and fears and resolved to make the flight. Then came the second sign of impending doom. The pilot who was in charge of preparing his plane for the flight, Kyle Bailey, also expressed his worry about the horrible weather conditions. For one, there was a thick fog gathering in the air and a darkness had descended into the skies. This would make visibility extremely difficult even for the most experienced of pilots, much less John, who had limited experience. He went on to express that he too was supposed to fly to Martha's Vineyard, where Lauren Bissett was headed, but he thought it wiser not to fly at all that day, and he urged John to do the same. On top of all that, John had been involved in a hand gliding accident a few weeks before, and although he felt much better, caution was still advised. Flying a plane was the last thing he ought to be doing, considering all the terrible signs that were afoot. Again, his instructor had insisted that he accompany John in case he ran into trouble in the skies, but John declined. He wanted to do this alone and be away from the media and attention he had gotten all his life. He felt fairly confident that he could fly the plane and make it to the destination safely, and he assured his wife and sister-in-law of the same. So eventually, the three boarded the Piper Saratoga, and within a few minutes, they were airborne at around 8:38 p.m. This later became the biggest mistake of his entire life. At first, the flight was like any other normal flight, smooth and peaceful. Then, little by little, his fears began to materialize. The small aircraft, piloted by John, began to get swallowed by darkness as he attempted to guide it to their initial destination. Visibility at Martha's Vineyard had significantly diminished to 6 miles. John's newly obtained license restricted him to flying only in conditions with at least 5 miles of visibility, disallowing him from flying using instruments alone. As a VFR, Visual Flight Rules rated pilot, he was required to navigate using specific visual references. After acquiring this certification, pilots can advance to IFR, Instrument Flight Rules certification, enabling them to operate a plane solely by relying on instruments without looking out the window. Despite the expectation to reach Martha's Vineyard within an hour, deteriorating weather conditions posed a challenge, and John had not filed an appropriate flight plan. Reports suggested he did not maintain radio communication during the flight, thus missing out on crucial weather updates. While other small aircraft in the area chose to head inland as the fog thickened, John continued on his doomed course. The farther he went, the worse the weather became, and the more difficult it was to navigate. While the control tower watched on the radar, they only hoped that John could make it to the destination safely and in one piece, but they were proven sorely wrong. About an hour into the flight, the Piper Saratoga suddenly disappeared from the radar. This strongly suggested there had been a crash, but the question remains, what went wrong exactly? Now, we go back in time inside the Piper Saratoga to decipher what happened according to the results after an investigation conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board and expert analysis. This is where the story gets a little more terrifying. 62 minutes of flight and only 20 miles left to his destination, John finally checked in with Martha's Vineyard Airport and began his descent. However, an unexpected turn of events occurred. Although the exact sequence remains unknown, experts believe that JFK Jr. experienced what is known as spatial disorientation. This phenomenon can be particularly perilous for pilots without IFR certification when flying complex aircraft at night. The term black hole vertigo aptly describes John's situation as the black sea and sky emerged, leaving him unable to distinguish up from down. His instruments relayed one set of information, while his mind and instincts suggested another. For an inexperienced pilot, trusting the instruments becomes a challenge when one's senses convey conflicting data. This disconnect between reason, instinct, and reality can cause pilots to mistakenly adjust controls, believing the plane is veering off course, thereby leading to a loss of control. John's descent rate was alarming, dropping 700 feet per minute. At 9:34 p.m., the aircraft's altitude was 2,300 feet. 5 minutes later, John abruptly veered to the right, ascending to 2,600 feet. At 9:40 p.m., he suddenly lurched left, struggling to determine his position in the dark sky. The adverse weather conditions clouded his judgment, and a few moments later, the plane disappeared from radar. The worst had happened. In less than 30 seconds, the Piper Saratoga plummeted 700 feet, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean, merely 8 miles from shore. No Mayday distress signal was sent, suggesting there was insufficient time to respond to the rapid drop in altitude. John failed to stabilize the plane. According to Kyle Bailey, the pilot who had seen John depart from Essex County Airport, he believed the plane was inverted, meaning the aircraft was turned upside down just before the crash. Meanwhile, down at Martha's Vineyard, panic and pandemonium erupted when the aircraft didn't arrive as scheduled and a search party was sent out to find the missing plane. Coast Guard and Air Force personnel scoured the sea and the skies off the coastline. At first, authorities were fairly confident that they could find survivors, but the following day, when searchers picked up aircraft debris and a black suitcase belonging to Lauren, any hopes that anyone on the aircraft survived immediately faded. Regardless, a few people still held up a flicker of hope. No bodies had been found yet, and so the search had to continue. Little did they know that just a few days later, everyone's worst fears would finally be confirmed. 3 days after the crash, on July 19th, sonar from the NOAA vessel Rude picked up a debris field on the seabed. Divers descended to 120 feet to investigate, and on July 21st, the 3 bodies were pulled up from the twisted metal of the torn and battered fuselage. All 3 of them were still strapped in their seats. An autopsy revealed that they had all died on impact due to multiple traumas. News spread around the world, and headlines read that the Kennedy curse had struck once more. It was a tragic end to the three adults. John had been 38 years old, his wife just 33, and his sister-in-law 34. But with such a high-profile tragedy came many conspiracy theories. Some believed that he intentionally crashed the plane because he was struggling in both his marriage and work life. But others dispute this, as he was about to celebrate the wedding of his cousin. He and his wife were on good terms, and his magazine George had recently overcome some difficulties. It was a time for celebration, not despair. Others believed that the plane was tampered with. Those who opposed the Kennedy family and were worried that JFK Jr. would succeed in becoming president one day due to his immense popularity were blamed for the crash. But one of the most concerning theories was that some had witnessed an explosion in the sky around the time John's aircraft went down, signifying there was a bomb on board. More interestingly, another group believes that he was being silenced regarding his father's assassination. John had once been obsessed with finding out the truth behind his father's loss. He was determined to get all the facts, a dangerous obsession if those responsible were still alive. However, speculations aside, investigations revealed that the plane had not been tampered with, and there had been no explosion before it fell from the sky. Furthermore, the aircraft had passed a safety inspection less than a month earlier, and so mechanical failure was ruled out.
Kennedy Jr. was the son of John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Tragically, JFK Jr. was killed in a plane crash in 1999. Or was he? Yes, he was. Of course he was. But what if he wasn't?
Even in the face of all these facts drawn from expert investigators, fans of JFK Jr. optimistically claim that he is alive today and hiding somewhere in the remote wilderness of Pennsylvania, where he leads a lonely life far away from the media and unwanted attention. On July 22nd, John's ashes were scattered at sea off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. There was a disagreement over whether he should have a public or private memorial service. In the end, it was an invite-only occasion, and hundreds of mourners attended the service at the Church of St. Thomas More, a church he had frequented before. At his memorial service, his uncle Ted Kennedy was quoted to say that John F. Kennedy Jr., like his father, had every gift life had to offer except a long life.